that's all they know how to do. To take care of themselves. But I'll get back to you next week with that. Yeah. Hi, friends. We're going to start in about 2 minutes. So if you are staying for talk back, feel free to grab a seat. Be comfortable.
Check. All right. Is this on? And I will dance.
Oh, Ben wants to offer us a song selection.
I just want to dance like Mia danced last week.
Which is nothing.
Which is no dancing, yes. Devin's going to send you a text.
I got it,
okay,
yes.
Good. It wouldn't be talk back without a question from Devin.
No, it's the most important part. Well,
really glad
Wes,
to have
how we looking?
Some guests with us staying for talk back. If you're a guest, thanks for sticking around.
Yes. And we're live, so welcome to everybody who is joining us virtually, especially our friends out at Southminster. We are so glad that you stick around for Talkback. We appreciate it and your questions. Reverend Dr. Boswell.
The Right Reverend Mia McLean.
Yes. Well, let's jump in here. We have a few deep questions. Deep questions.
Okay.
We're deep diving today. Okay. Question number 1 says, it seems there were a whole bunch of things going on in this story. All sorts of things. I think this person said deceiving actors, all sorts of just chaos.
Yes.
Do those tell us anything about ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, there's always one technique that we can take to approaching the biblical text is to find ourselves in the story, and to do so with honesty. And that's challenging to do. And I think it's always helpful to find ourselves as both antagonist and protagonist in the story, to see ourselves in both places and to imagine what we might do in those circumstances. Obviously, the story tries to paint King Herod in a picture of being a man trapped by his conviction not to kill John and his new wife. I think that's probably a glowing portrait of King Herod presented to us by the Bible, given what we know of who he was historically. Not a good dude. No one in the Herodian family. Just so you know, those who are not historians of the Bible, this is Herod the Great's, one of Herod the Great's sons, Herod Antipas. So Herod, who is spoken of in the birth stories of Jesus, is not the same Herod who we're talking about here that killed John and was involved in Jesus' death. That's Herod's son and then Herod the Great. So father and son, both tyrants, both in cahoots with Rome, both disastrous figures who play different roles of terror and violence throughout the New Testament. But I think we have to see ourselves in the story, find out who we might be and how we might show up. Usually, the best path for those of us who imagine we are followers of Jesus is to see the disciples, to try to imagine ourselves as the disciples, and to think about how the disciples, what were they learning a lesson? Were they being challenged to do something? Were they struggling? In this case, John's disciples are struggling with his death, and Jesus' disciples are coming back off of having been sent out for the mission. And this little aside is in the middle here, this backstory. So you can imagine as Jesus' disciples would have related with John's disciples, learning about the death of their teacher, and almost like a prologue and a foreshadowing of what was to come later down the road in Jesus' life. Yeah, there are a lot of slimy things going on in this story. Somebody on the way out said they felt tremendous hope after this sermon, and I said, I'm glad to hear that. It's hard to preach on hope on the beheading of John. It's a very disturbing story. I think it definitely reveals our human capacity, not just for violence, right? Violence is something that sometimes can happen just passionately. People can get upset. This story is really calculated, horrific violence. Beheading someone at the request of a daughter after a dance. It's grotesque. It's macabre. And it does reveal sometimes the corruption in our politics and our lives as well. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you for that. We have another question here. It says, when Bill Leonard was here a few weeks ago, he discussed at Talkback trying to find common areas to work with other fundamentalist churches, evangelicals, et cetera, people who have differences from us, different theologies and ideologies from us. This person's question is, how and why do those who hate and fear the other not see the same intolerance in their faith as they do, for example, in the Sharia law or the Taliban?
There was a great quote that Judy Schindler put on Facebook this morning that said, if you know only one religion, you know no religion at all. If you know only one religion, you don't know religion at all. Meaning that we can't really even understand our own religion deeply if we don't also have some sense of understanding and empathy toward other religious traditions, other people of faith in different backgrounds. That helps us to put our tradition in a different light and to understand the differences about our faith than our Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or whatever, brothers, atheist friends and family. So I think we start with empathy. I do think that one of the reasons why people can't see that is it's very hard when you come to believe that your tradition is not only right, but better than all the other traditions. Then it's almost impossible to take anything else very seriously. When you've decided that your religion, your belief system, and there's a language for this. A lot of people have begun to talk about what we call Christian supremacy. Christian supremacy is the idea that Christianity is the supreme religion, which has been of the West, but that that Christians often act like everything else is religion and Christianity is up here. It's something different. And that also colors the way we think about, nobody's asking for Muslim prayer in schools. They want Christian prayer in schools. Nobody's asking for the Quran to be taught in elementary schools. They want the Bible taught in elementary schools. See, that's Christian supremacy. If you really want religion to be taught in schools, then you want all religions to be taught in schools, right? And so, again, a sign of Christian supremacy. When we come to believe that what we have is not only right but better, we really have a hard time having any reciprocity or objective perspective about any other faith tradition. So I think it's our pride that hurts us.
So what about within Christian traditions? How does that affect how we relate to each other? How do you, I think what the heart of this person is trying to get at here is, Bill encouraged us to try to transgress borders within Christianity for the betterment of humanity. And how do you do that if it is such a radical ideological difference and people not being able to see themselves, particularly in the story? Everybody wants to see themselves as sort of the good person, but how do you transgress that boundary if they're not able to see themselves as Herod?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's our job to help another person see themselves as Herod in the story. That could be a little presumptuous. But I would say, I think sometimes we're treating other people of our own faith, Christians for that matter, who we think we're all in the same boat together, right? We're all people who follow Jesus, but we're not. We're very much not. There is a way in which Christianity becomes something that it's not. Now, all of us, right, are flawed, and all of our faiths are imperfect. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's a way in which a person can manipulate the Christian faith or syncretize it with American empire, anything, patriarchy, all kinds of different ideologies, racism, white supremacy, and it just becomes something that it was not. It becomes something different that's no longer Christianity. That doesn't mean that everything you merge with Christianity makes it bad. That's not true. But there are certain things that are just not gospel. Anything that says any other human being is better than another simply because of the color of their skin, or basically really anything, is not gospel and has to be opposed. It's anti-Christ. Anything that says anybody is better than anybody else is anti-Christ. So that would go for any political system, any religious system, any philosophy, any ideology. And you can't put that with the teachings of Jesus and then think that the teachings of Jesus don't get messed up. Right? Like there's that old joke about mixing the empire and Christianity, or mixing church and state is like mixing ice cream with horse manure. It doesn't really do much to the manure, but it really messes up the ice cream. Right? You can really mess up your ice cream by mixing a bunch of manure in it, right? And it doesn't do much to the manure. When you put like racism in with your Christianity, it doesn't make the racism better. It makes the Christianity a bunch of manure. That's what happens. And so you mess up the Christianity every time you add something that is totally opposed, a philosophy that's totally opposed to the teachings of Jesus. So I think this idea that we're all, like on the same journey, that's actually not making it easy for us to talk. Sometimes it's better to just imagine we're not on the same journey. Now let's talk, right? We don't actually have Jesus in common. Not that Jesus is not my Jesus. We don't actually have Jesus in common. We don't even have the scriptures in common because the way we interpret it is so wildly different. And this is why we've had all these battles, right, between Catholics and Protestants, and people were killing Baptists upside down because they wouldn't agree to the 39 Articles or recite a creed. We've had wars and violence and murder and death and horrific things because of religion. And that was because people came to believe they really weren't believing in the same things, the interpretation. And those were debates over, like, what is communion? Who can read the Bible? Not like what we're talking about now, which is people like life and death, right? So I think that this idea that we're all on the same journey is probably not. I mean, we're all humans, so that's where the commonality comes from. But sometimes when we think that religion is what holds us in common, then we're actually going to we're not going to get anywhere because it's a dead end. The way we approach religion is completely opposite, and it will become a dead-end conversation. It's better just to say, okay, let's bracket our religious ideas for a minute. Let's talk about being human. What's going on in your life? Who are you? What
what's
matters
going on in
to
the
you?
world? What can we do?
Yeah.
What activity can we do to
Right.
make the world a better place?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. How can we do something together that will bring love and freedom and liberation to the world?
I'm sorry to belabor this point, but do you think that sometimes you just got to walk away?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah.
I know there's all this movement and encouragement to want to transgress and to want to bridge people together, but is there a point in people's journey where it's just not worth it?
Well, that's the story right before this one. Because the disciples had just sent out on a journey, and what does Jesus say to them? If you come into a town and you offer them my message of love and peace, and they say, no, we don't want it, kick the dust off your feet and move on. Kick the dust off your feet and move on.
Yeah.
That is not him saying, no, stay there, water down the message that I had so that people will come to unity with each other and create a false community where nobody can tell the truth. Everybody's kind of like least common denominator faith, all that. That's not what he says. Be real. Jesus is about truth and reality. Be real, tell them the truth, and then whatever happens, happens. Kick the dust off your feet. If they don't accept it, move on. Move on to a new community. Or the other thing is, I think sometimes we get messed up about that text. Jesus says, kick the dust off their feet and move to the next town. Sometimes you can kick the dust off your feet and stay right where you are. Right? So what do they say about, like, brush it off your shoulder, right? Shake it off, Taylor Swift says. Shake it off. Move on. People don't have to agree with you for you to be happy and live your life. I think that's and the other thing is we need communities like this one, really, which is about a place where we disagree and yet stay in community. It's not about a common agreement here. It's not about forcing people to believe in a creed or a code or whatever. It's about being in community regardless of the fact that we know we disagree, that we're not on the same page all the time. That's what soul liberty, freedom of conscience, liberty of conscience, the Baptist core principle means. Freedom of the pulpit and the pew, right? So we all are free to come to our own conclusions about things. There's no manipulation of people's ideas or forcing people to recite a creed or whatever. That's not who we are. And so we need more spaces, common spaces where people can come together knowing that they disagree, but the point is to be in relationship regardless of disagreement. So I think that would be helpful. Yeah. But I also think, kick the dust off your feet, right?
Kick it off, yes. So we have a question here. Did Jesus appreciate all the wonderful things people did for other people? Do we appreciate all the things others do for other people instead of making us feel bad for being oppressors?
Good question. I think I would challenge everybody today to go home and read Matthew 23. Write it in your phones. Put it somewhere so you go do it tonight. Go read Matthew 23. And then come back next week and ask me about what Jesus says to people about their good deeds and about oppressors. Jesus was not impressed with people's good deeds. He did not, it's not a works righteousness situation for Jesus where we can earn our way into the kingdom by doing good things or congratulating people for doing good things. I challenge you to find a place in the Bible where Jesus congratulates someone for doing something good.
All right.
I'm just not there. So that's one. And then Jesus is very clear about oppression. If you read Matthew 23, one of the things that I quoted from there this week, John the Baptist was not the only one who called the Pharisees, the scribes, and the priests a brood of vipers and snakes. That was Jesus' language. Jesus said that. Jesus said a whole lot of strong language about their tithes and offerings, which they were doing as good works that they thought were going to earn their place in the kingdom. All their tithes and offerings and the good things. And Jesus said, you're tithing in one hand and you're oppressing people in the other. And you're not dealing with the oppression side, and you think that this is somehow going to work. Or the same thing, this Old Testament prophet said this too. You're worshiping God on Sunday morning or wherever, Saturday, if you were Jewish at the time, right? But you're oppressing the poor during the week. God doesn't listen to your prayers then. God's not hearing your worship. Your worship is worthless if you're not also doing justice. That's basically every prophetic book in the Old Testament has some message like that. Jesus says the same thing. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He means don't come with your animals to burn and your grain offerings or even your money and think that takes care of everything. I want you to be merciful and loving to other people. And mercy is not just being nice to your neighbor. It's also creating a society of mercy, creating a politics of mercy, a social community of mercy where people are treated with mercy in their world, which means we have to deal with oppression. So I think all these things are connected to each other. It doesn't mean that Jesus was not happy all the time. I think Jesus is very jovial and actually quite joking around a lot, very sarcastic, sometimes quite cynical, makes jokes about the Pharisees and
a little angry.
Sometimes gets straight up angry and mad. Jesus is a human being, right? So he had all the range of human emotions. But I think that the idea that Jesus is constantly sitting around congratulating people who are already doing okay financially is just not happening. I mean, the Beatitudes are him congratulating the people who are on the bottom rung of the social ladder, right? Yes. That's the people who are the poorest, the most oppressed, what does he say? Blessed are the persecuted, right? Not blessed are those, just doing good things in the world, right? So there's a very specific kind of message he's trying to provide. Doesn't mean that we should not do good things for our neighbor. That's not it at all. Right? Love God and love neighbor means we should be doing that. But the idea that the gospel is constantly congratulating us for doing good things, that's kind of a works righteousness perspective, I think.
Yes. The philanthropic world is shaking in their boots with your answer.
I mean, we still have to do good things for each other, but what does Jesus say? Give and don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Well, if I got up in the pulpit every week start talking about all the good things that our church is doing, that's not the right hand not telling the left hand what they're doing. That's us bragging about ourselves all the time. Yeah, telling the whole world all the great things that we're doing. That's not what the gospel was about. It says, do things in secret. Do good things in secret so that, your righteousness. Because if you don't do it in secret, what happens? Jesus says that you've already gotten your reward if it's not in secret. Right? So right? It says, do all your good works in secret and don't tell people about it, because the reward then in that case is the public notoriety that you did something good. Jesus says if you do it in secret, then your reward is treasure in heaven, whatever that means. But sounds nice.
Well, we have another question. Get ready for this. During your sermon, Ben, I found myself thinking a lot about the almost instinctual way that society paints murder victims as martyrs. We do this a lot with revolutionaries like Jesus and Martin Luther King. But we also do this with people like George Floyd, who many said died for racial justice instead of facing the reality that racism killed him. I'm curious if you can speak to this and how we can counter this push.
Okay, so that's hard because all death, all murder is awful. Anyone who's murdered for any reason whatsoever or executed by the state, even if they were actually a treasonous person, it's still, right, all death we should be grieved about, right? It's why, when we just had a death of somebody recently. Who was that? That was was it Rumsfeld who passed away recently? And some folks were saying, I hope he rots in hell for being a war criminal. Now, look, was he a war criminal? Yes. But do you have to also hope that he rots in hell? No. So there's a way of being truthful without also condemning and damning someone for eternity, right? And also saying, I'm sorry for his family. I'm sorry for his loved ones. That death is terrible for anybody. It doesn't matter who dies. Doesn't matter how awful they are. They have loved ones, they have family. He's got grandkids, right? I think about those children and grandchildren. We can be, we can be compassionate about that situation and at the same time tell the truth about a person, right? Who was involved in the torture program that America created after 9/11, and many other things. I could go on. But you can say the truth and also say, and it's horrible to have someone die. And we pray for his family and his loved ones. We don't have to have this both and bipolar kind of ideology there. So I think that, so that's one thing. Like, death is always a problem. Now, you don't get to be a martyr, historically speaking, just because you die. Right? The Bible kind of has categories. You get to be a saint if you die. Now, that's where we depart from the Catholics. Like, just anybody who dies is considered a saint. In fact, people who were living were called the saints in the Bible also. But typically you're sainted. You're passed on. You're part of the community. You're in the great cloud of witnesses. You're sainted, right? But martyrs means someone who specifically dies for the faith. And so in that case, right, you think about people like the early Christian martyrs who were being crucified by the Roman Empire because they would not, at that time, confess the creed that Caesar was God. They would not bend the knee. They would not confess that creed because they thought that to do so was to betray Jesus and their faith. And so they wouldn't do it. And so they were murdered. And so those are martyrs. But we also consider people martyrs if they die, if they are assassinated as a part of a movement for peace and justice in the world. And now that, of course, differs on whether you believe the movement was for peace and justice and love in the world. But some people don't like all the movements. But, I mean, the people who have been executed in the Black Freedom Movement is a long, 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 long list. Starting, you could say Medgar Evers, but it goes back before Medgar Evers. And you talk about Medgar Evers and then Malcolm X and then Emmett Till and Martin Luther King Jr. and Fred Hampton. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. and Fred Hampton were killed a year after each other. Plus, you got in the middle of there, you got Bobby Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. And
but Emmett Till necessarily wasn't a martyr,
right? Because
he was not a part of the movement. He was just an innocent bystander,
right? But I think the way in which the movement is looking at Emmett Till is saying this person was killed because of their race predominantly, and therefore, because race is a lie. and because racism is anti-Christian, therefore they are automatically a martyr of the movement of love and peace and justice and Jesus in the world, because they were murdered for the very thing that Jesus came to oppose, which is any form or system or ideology that says that one person is better than other, especially an entire country based on the lie of whiteness that says that a whole group of people, European Americans, are better than everybody else, and there should have legal and political protections and power as a result of it. So Jesus would be opposed to all of that. So in that case, anyone who dies as a victim of that system then becomes a martyr too. And it's challenging to think about it like that. But, the Martin Luther King Jr., you can see how he is more similar to Jesus maybe, and than maybe Emmett Till, right? Because Jesus and Martin Luther King, they know they're causing trouble, right? They know they're preaching justice. They know they're preaching love. They know they're trying to change society. And then they get killed. They sort of know. I mean, King was anxious about his murder his whole life, right? Jesus talked about his death all the time. He's telling disciples, it's coming, because this message I have, it's so radical, they're coming for me. Plus the Pharisees are telling him they're going to kill him every other chapter, right? So it's coming. It's eventually coming. That's a little different, right? That's somebody who's sort of at the head of the movement than someone who dies as a consequence of being caught up in the system or ideology of whiteness. But I think the reason why people can do that is because of what we have come through liberation theology to understand about the cross, which is that in Jesus' death, regardless of what his ministry was in life, in his death, he died in solidarity with everyone who dies as an innocent victim of imperial power or ideology. He dies really in solidarity with all of humanity too, all of our sufferings, our humanness. But he dies specifically at the site of imperial oppression and violence in Rome, one of the worst forms of torture and death ever created in human history. He dies there in solidarity with anyone who dies as a result of the brutality and oppression of an empire or an imperial force and system. So that's how I think you can get Emmett Till and George Floyd and all the martyrs of the movement now into that same conversation.
Thank you. We have a very long question. This person's had to leave for a meeting, but they said they're going to watch the recording to see what you have to say.
Oh boy, all right.
Thank you for speaking the truth that the loudest voices against critical race theory are Christians. Yet my experience of the 20 years in the evangelical church is that they don't whitewash the gospel, they glorify the violence of it. Example, making us listen to the medical account of crucifixion, being nailed to a cross in youth group, and giving us a nail to take home to remember that we caused the bloody details and pain of Jesus' death. As a youth, she says. She says, I would argue they are fine with this discomfort of children because it aids in their power structure and keeping power over children, whereas critical race theory, though they don't even know what it is, does not aid in upholding white Christian power and power over their white children, which is why it must be destroyed. Do you agree?
It's sort of like, check yes or no, right? Yes, I agree. I think that's actually quite a profound interpretation or analysis of what's going on. So I did get into some of this in my sermon, but sermon is only so much. You can't do all of it. On the one hand, it is wildly hypocritical, to the point of absurdity, that the same people who are teaching their children about the bloody death of Jesus as young as 1, 2, 3, 4, as I said in the story, 4-year-old, are the same who are saying, no, you can't disrupt, disturb, or discomfort my child in your public education system with history, with the reality of slavery, right? That is so wildly hypocritical, it's not even worth almost talking about. But of course, here we are in this Fox News-induced panic that we're in at this point, created by Tucker Carlson, so we're going to have to deal with it now. And there are schools all over the country that are putting, rules in place. Teachers are getting fired. This is not just a thing that we can rail against from our armchair, people's lives have been destroyed by this already, and we're just at the beginning of this, right? So that's one thing we have to acknowledge there. And the hypocrisy is ridiculous. So how can you teach the truth that the Savior of the world, or sometimes they'll say, God, sent his son to die
for you,
on the cross. That's not distressing? Who is God in that story? A murderer. That's very distressing. And if that's not distressing to a child, I don't know what is. And by the way, there are volumes of psychological research about the ways that children have been horrifically messed up psychologically by growing up in fundamentalist and evangelical traditions on that point alone, because they start to believe that God is fratricidal, right? I heard a woman once tell me, who was going through the worst pain in her life, oppressed by other people. She said, by his stripes we are healed, meaning by my pain I get to be healed. This woman was being beaten by her husband. Now, she's not getting healed by her husband's beating, right? That's not healing. There's no redemption in that, right? And that's how that leads from a fratricidal God to a fratricidal life, that somehow any suffering we experience is somehow redemptive for us. And that's just not true. And so that's pretty awful. And we're teaching that children. Then these same people are going to say, no, wait, no, don't tell them about slavery and the fact they used a whip on the plantation. No. Now, they used a whip on Jesus. That's cool. Yeah, we did that. That happened. That's important for you to know. But you can't know that we white people used a whip on a plantation. Now, wait a second. That's hypocritical, right? So on the one hand, right, the hypocrisy is there. But then she's trying to flip it to say, but they also are teaching the blood and gore, right, in Christianity, because you can use it as power over children, to scare them, control children, and keep people in place. Whereas the critical race theory is not used, it's actually used for liberation and emancipation of children, right? Because we can't get, white people are trapped in a history they can't understand, and until they understand it, they won't be released from it. Baldwin, we can't be released from this scourge of systemic racism until we understand the history we're trapped in. He says we're trapped like a butterfly on a pin, flapping around, not even realizing that we're trapped. And so until we understand the history we're trapped in, we'll never be free from it. So what's critical race theory doing? By the way, first of all, it's not even critical race theory. That's crazy. There's no critical race theory being taught in any schools in America. There never has been, and there probably never will be. That's total hogwash and ludicrous fabricated panic. What they've associated with critical race theory is basically just anything anti-racist or just historical truth. That's what we're talking about. Banning historical truth and anything anti-racist from public education. Is that going to make our world a better place? Hell no. It's going to make our world so much worse, as if we're not already uneducated about the history of slavery in America. Anybody who's gone through the whiteness series knows what I'm talking about here. There's so much there we have never wrestled with, never learned in school. And now they're trying to take out even more than that, so we'll be even less informed than we are now. So I think she's saying it's about control and power. And of course, it's also about just white people remaining in denial, never coming out of denial about what we've done, what we've been, the advantages that we've had, never being able to accept responsibility for that, never being able to if we can't accept responsibility for it, we'll never change this country. Right, and I think all of it is related to the fact, like you would never have this conversation in Germany about Nazism, right? You can't even wave a Confederate flag in Germany without it's against the law. Sorry, not a Confederate, a Nazi flag, but you can do a Confederate flag here. But it's a Nazi flag there. What's the difference? Same thing, right? Millions of people died during the slave trade. Way more than died in the Holocaust. Way, way more than died in the Holocaust. By a large margin. Did we have a Nuremberg trial for anybody involved in slavery? Did the plantation owners have to account for their crimes? Did the politicians that enforced slavery have to answer or pay reparations? Did we even give the people who received it their 40 acres and a mule? No, we didn't give any of that. None of that happened. There was no trial. There was nothing. In fact, some of you might not know this, but the Civil War generals, my father taught me this actually as a child, and he's a lost cause Civil War. He loves that history, brilliant about it. The Civil War generals who fought in the Civil War, they were defrocked for a time, but then they got their rank back and were invited back into the army to fight in our wars in the Philippines and other places as we did imperial work. So the great Civil War generals who fought to defend the Confederacy, they got to keep their rank. They got to keep fighting for this country in the Philippines and other places. They didn't have to pay any reparations. They didn't have to deal with their crimes, right? So we've never had an accounting. And because we've never had an accounting of what happened, we're always going to continue to replicate the same problems over and over again. So that's what people are just trying to avoid. It's been so long now, they just want to keep swiping it under the rug. You know, what's 400 years of slavery between friends, you know? And it's just, it's never going to work. We're just going to keep finding ourselves in the same problem until we deal with it.
Yes, indeed. Well, I hope she hears this when she watches later. Our final question: how do we remain hopeful and determined and encourage others to do so in the midst of our current mess?
Now, hope is a controversial term. Remember we had Miguel de la Torre here who told us that we had to stop being hopeful because hopefulness was a distraction from the movement. I'm not sure I agree. I think we need hope. And I think in this story, what I tried to show is so interesting how Mark just kind of throws this in there between the sending out and the feeding of the 5,000, almost to try to explain why was King Herod so afraid? Well, he was afraid because he had John killed. He did something unjust. And he was afraid that they were going to have to, he was afraid just like the parents are afraid of critical race theory today. If we take it seriously, we're going to have to account for our crimes. We're going to have to deal with what happened in reality. We're going to have to deal with the truth. We're going to have to face what we did and take responsibility for it. Herod is a perfect example of that, a metaphor for that. But in that story, in Herod's fear is the hope. Herod fears that John has been raised, and the answer, the good news is he has. He has been raised in Jesus. Jesus is the resurrection of John in this story. Jesus is the embodiment of John's mission and ministry. Mentored by John, he took on John's message of the kingdom of God. He followed in John's footsteps. He was calling truth to power constantly. In fact, he was probably more aggressive than John. John never said anything like what Jesus did in Matthew 23. Jesus was way more aggressive than John by the end, which is why they came to get him, right? He didn't get put in jail for a while. He was in jail for barely a night before he was on the cross, right? They were ready to put Jesus to death. And so I think, but the hope in the story is that it doesn't matter what the empire does to the prophets, God will keep raising a movement. It doesn't promise that God is going to solve all the problems of American history in one generation. That's not the promise. We always hope for that. Will I see the promised land in my generation? I see some of y'all folks out there with a little bit grayer hair than me saying, no, I won't. I get it. But that's not what the hope is. The hope has never been that we're going to see it in our generation, right? Moses stands at the edge of the promised land and says, I'm not going with you, right? King, in his last sermon, says, I can see the promised land from here, but I can't go there with you, right? It's not ours to inherit the promised land. That's not the promise. The promise is that God will be with us and will continue to raise a movement of love and justice and revolution and liberation in our world that builds the beloved kingdom no matter how many prophets they kill. And that's the hard reality, right? Because that's where we have to own there will be death, there will be destruction, there will be persecution. Jesus promises us that. And at the same time, God will be with us, and God is building a new world. Yeah. And as long as we have that hope and that faith that God is building a new world, then we can stay in the struggle.
That is a beautiful ending note. Right on time. I was going to make a hair joke about Ben, but I'm not going to do it.
Wait, Mia, now you didn't talk about the dancing. We didn't talk about dancing. We got to get into how your sermon and my sermon are a contrast.
Yes. Okay.
One more question then. Come on.
One more. You have the question. You seem to have the question.
No, I just thought, so one of the things that Mia and I have been talking about this week is, isn't it interesting, because we didn't plan this at all, that the Spirit led Mia to preach on dancing last week, and to empower us to dance like David danced, and to sing up there and make it harder for me to preach. But anyway, so she knocked it out of the park in an amazing sermon about how we need to dance, and dancing in the midst of this moment is one way that we find hope. And then the next week is the epitome story in the Bible of how dancing goes wrong.
Yes. So here's two things.
So what is the Spirit doing, Mia? What is the Spirit?
So there's more than one way to look at a story and or dancing. So the sermon last week, I'm sure taking a positive spin on David. And other people take a negative spin on David's dancing, right? They said David's dancing, it's a fertility dance. David is pompous. David is aggressive. Then we don't really talk about his wife, Michal.
She is not happy about the dancing.
If I were to preach that same text from her point of view, it probably would not look so favorably upon David's dancing. But for the purpose of what I was trying to say, I think it's two sides. It's two sides, right?
Right.
I think we are always remembering something, even if it's evil. Mm-hmm. Yes. When we dance. So in your sermon, she's remembering something ungodly, something evil, right?
Right.
While dancing, but it's still a remembering. It's calling up. Even if I'm dancing on the graves of children, I'm remembering evil. I'm remembering what that means.
Yeah,
even though it's evil.
She's really, what she's trying to do is justify and eliminate any critique of her marriage, her new father and her father's marriage to her mother. Her new father's marriage to her mother. Both the daughter and mother were named Herodias, which is why the text gets confusing. So it's Herodias dancing, and it's Herodias who gets the head on the platter, both Herodias. But you're right, she's trying to remember the marriage and build a new family on the death of the prophet. Because the only way to get forward is to eliminate John so that John's critique dies with him. And she can build this family on that.
So the thing is, it's not that the dancing isn't generative, is what are we generating with the dancing?
Right.
Are we generating hope? Are we generating peace, joy, something that's going to keep us in the midst of devastation? Or are we generating death and evil?
And Jesus talks about dancing too. Jesus has this say, what will I compare this generation? I played the flute for you and you did not dance. I played the lyre for you and you did not mourn, right? And what he's saying to the generation of people is, you're celebrating when you should be mourning, and you're mourning what you should be celebrating, right? So in our time, it would be, we're celebrating the violence that's happening, or the oppression, and we're mourning Black Lives Matter, right? Or we're mourning critical race theory, which we should be celebrating, and we're celebrating some other kind of violence and oppression. So Jesus would say to his generation the same as he said to ours, I played the flute and you did not dance, right? So you keep not dancing for the things I tell you to dance for, right? You keep not celebrating God's movement of love and truth and beauty in the world, but you keep dancing for the things you should be mourning over: oppression, injustice, hatred in the world, right? And that's the same kind of story, right? It's really about, what are we dancing for? What are we celebrating, right? And in that case, David, even though there's other problems to the text, is celebrating the right things in the story, whereas Herodias in this story is dancing for the wrong reasons. Yeah.
Well, you got your dance bit in.
I just want to make sure they got all that, Mia. It's hard to follow you.
We thank everybody at Southminster and everywhere else who watched virtually, and those of you who stayed. If you have follow-up questions, send Ben an email so that he can talk to you about all the things that are coming up for you in the sermons. Thank y'all for joining us.
See y'all next week.